Celeste, a game with unreal speed and incredible movement. But how do top speedrunners move that quickly? And what is the difference between even a higher level speedrunner and a top speedrunner? This game does not have a lot of big time save strats. Most strats you see top runners do don't even save a second compared to an easier alternative. So where does most of the time saving come from? This is where movement comes into play. Contrary to what you might think, it's not the flashy moves or the speedrun tech that is referred to as movement by speedrunners. Movement is a thing that exists in basically every speed game, and some core concepts definitely overlap across all different speedrunning games. There's a saying that strats save seconds, while movement saves minutes. So, what's movement? If a strat is what exactly you plan to do for a room in this game, then movement is how well you execute this plan of yours. That is the basic gist of it, but there is also some overlap between strats and movement, as sometimes a strat can be changed to move more efficiently through the room without it being harder. A more accurate description would be to minimize and streamline your strats to get the most efficient outcome. I recommend watching AverageImposter's Basic Mechanics Guide video first, because in this video I will assume that you know what a hyper or super is, and go over what good movement even is, and teach you how to move faster in this video game. Good movement can be way more nuanced than just pressing buttons faster. There are a lot of factors that could come into play. The same strat can have very different results depending on your movement. Movement mostly consists of 3 core principles that I will talk in depth about: tidying up your execution, game knowledge, and lastly, bottlenecks. Let's start with the first of these, tidying up your execution. Just doing the stuff you're currently doing quicker can be a huge time save, especially if you consider that it adds up quite a bit over the course of a run if you could do that for most of your current strat. You often don't really have to hesitate that much while playing the game, so practice and figure out how early you can input your actions. This is most movement time save at a beginner level, but is definitely always applicable even at higher levels. Use the speedrun tool mod, tutorial and download link in the video description, and just test what your limits are on how soon you can actually input stuff. A key mechanic to help you with inputting your next action as soon as possible is the relatively generous buffer window. You have 4 frames before an action can happen, where if you hold the button, it will perform your input on the first possible frame to often give you thus, with the frame where the input can actually happen, a 5-frame window. This can often be used so that if you hold your button a little early, you can input your next move sooner than you initially thought. Buffers can be used out of anything you can think of, be it screen transitions, pauses, landings, you name it. Another thing to improve your execution is something that seems very niche at first glance, but is used all over the run, and is one of the most important additional binds: a second jump button. Having 2 accessible jump buttons makes some strats and some speedrun tech way easier, but also can be used to optimize movement. Every time you have to jump again after a jump, a second jump button can help. With the second jump button, you can press and hold one jump button and use the other for your jumps while not losing height, as jump is always held. Also, jumps give you the same vertical speed for 12 frames if you hold down the button, so you can space them out a bit with no worries. Second jump button usage can be applied in basically every chapter, as you always have to do some form of climbing and isn't just limited to climb jumps, but also can be used for neutrals and wall kicks. By many players overlooked at first, a way to improve your gameplay is to simplify your strats. The less inputs you can do to get your desired outcome, the better. It may look cool to do a bunch of inputs, but with more inputs you need to worry about optimizing each of them. At worst, you can even do so many unnecessary actions that it's actually slower than a very simple alternative. However, sometimes it is the better choice to do something slightly slower if it's easier to optimize. It's important to know if something is faster, of course, but if you can't get it faster consistently, it's better to opt for something more reliable. Consistent time save is better than just flat out time save. But to help you even more with that, it's best that we go to the biggest section of this video: game knowledge. There are a lot of little tidbits that can play a role in optimizing your gameplay. Like that any form of jump through, like wooden platforms or clouds, push you up for every frame you're inside them while not moving downwards. So you can do a dash earlier than you think, or move through a jump through to gain that small upwards push to save a little bit of time. While other things are understanding chapter specific mechanics better, like dream blocks, bubbles, feathers and others. Or the information is so niche that it's basically never relevant except maybe for one place in the game. I will omit the most niche stuff and will refer you to the Mechanics Explained playlist for some chapter specific mechanics like feathers. This section will still be very long and I'll throw a lot of numbers at you, but the numbers themselves aren't that important to remember, just how they're in relation to each other. You can also skip this part if it seems overwhelming and head straight to the bottleneck section of this video if you so wish. But learning more about the intricacies of Celeste will not only make you go faster, but it will also help with consistency, and you will understand more easily what is happening when watching gameplay. The most fundamental knowledge is the speed correlation between your different movement options. So let's start looking at vertical upward speed. The fastest options, starting from the slowest, are climbing up a wall, then a hyper, then anything with a normal jump arc, then a wall bounce, then surprisingly a diagonal dash, and then the fastest thing being an upwards dash. Often there are situations where you want to combine your options, but as a general guideline you want to maximize the fastest option to its utmost potential. So jumping late in your dash to cancel it, then keeping the wall bounce speed as long as possible before having to cancel it with the jump. A common bad habit is to cancel your fastest option too early, be it jumping really early for your wall bounce, or then cancelling your wall bounce early with the climb jump. Also commonly found is jumping before dashing upwards. As a jump is one of the slowest options to move upwards, you want to try to avoid jumping first if just a dash and a wall bounce get you to your goal. Finally, for another common bad habit people have, you want to make sure to not release jump early when not necessary. So when moving upwards and doing multiple jumps, make sure to use one jump button while holding another one. But also make sure to keep jump held when dashing to not accidentally release it early and thus losing a little bit of vertical height. Moving on from generalized vertical movement, let's move on to one of the most important mechanics and talk in depth about jumps. Jumping has three main components: the upward speed, the half gravity at peak height, and then the falling speed. I talked earlier about how jumps have the same speed for 12 frames. Then 6 frames later, gravity has slowed you down enough that you start to be below 40 pixels per second. If your vertical speed is between that 40 pixels per second threshold, then as long as you have jump held, you get half gravity applied. Of course, if your vertical speed then exceeds 40 pixels per second, you get back to normal gravity, even when holding jump. Sometimes it's important to know when to avoid half gravity, as you might land a bit later or even miss landing back on a block when buffering a bunny hop. At other times, you can abuse half gravity to just barely miss obstacles. If you realize, I mentioned that half gravity starts to get applied 6 frames after your max vertical speed for a normal jump. In these 6 frames, it doesn't matter if you hold jump or not. And if you want to land quickly, you can use that timing window to try to get clean landings. Of course, this only applies in places where you can do that single jump. But we want to simplify as much as possible after all. But this whole frame window story is only for anything that uses a normal jump arc. So how does this apply to other types of jumps, like hypers and wall bounces? Hypers have a lower jump arc, exactly half of a normal one. So while you also have a constant vertical speed for 12 frames, you're already nearly at the half gravity threshold of 40 pixels per second afterwards. Huge disclaimer. I have been saying hyper when talking about wave dashes sometimes. This is because they work the exact same way, so I will not differ between them most of the time. Just assume everything I say applies to wave dashes as well. Back to the regular program. Wall bounces work a bit differently. They set your speed to 160 for a whopping 15 frames if you hold jump. And as you have so much speed, gravity will take a while to slow you down into the half gravity window. So the window in between where it doesn't matter if you hold jump is 9 whole frames. Now, if you noticed something in this clip, there's a way to simplify the correct timing of wall bounces in certain places. Updemoing the dash. To be able to abuse the buffer window even more, in certain places it's better to not do a normal dash, but a crouch dash upwards. This so-called updemo will make it so you reach the corner later, as Madeline's hitbox shrinks from the top down. But as we have to look at the bottom pixel for landings, this slight shift in position can be the difference in reaching a platform optimally or just barely missing it. This whole thing only applies when buffering the jump for a wall bounce though, and can also have some negatives. But there's a second case where updemos save time. But before delving deeper into that time save, and some general negatives to updemoing, I have to explain another game mechanic. Corner correction. Corner correction is a leniency mechanic where if you would collide with the wall on the next frame, it will correct you around a corner by up to 4 pixels. This is not only limited to dashing on top of a platform or dashing under a wall, but actually works with every dash direction. Corner correction only applies while dashing, except when trying to correct around a ceiling. Then it works even outside of dash state, but they still have an advantage in that case, as the horizontal range extends by 1 pixel when trying to corner correct around the ceiling with a dash. Now, how that mechanic has to do with updemos, it's best we look at where the game puts you after corner correction. It will always put you on a normalized position afterwards, which is your top pixel aligned with the ceiling. As the game runs in 60 FPS, an updash moves you by 4 pixels per frame, so you can just be outside of the collision check of the ceiling on one frame, then on the next frame being next to the ceiling, and on the following frame you moved up by 1 pixel when getting corner corrected. Which would mean you lose 3 pixels of your dash movement due to corner correction on this example. Now, what happens if you demo is that your top 5 pixels get cut off, so you reach the corner correction window 1 frame later, but on a different position. This can result in you getting less or even nothing of your dash cut short. Of course, this is not always an advantage, but 3/4 of the time you gain a pixel, while 1/4 of the time you get your dash cut off by 3 pixels compared to a regular dash. However, you shouldn't replace literally every updash with an updemo, as there can be some more disadvantages. This would be getting less jump through correction, reaching a transition later, or even missing a wall entirely during the dash, and other niche interactions. But in the cases where that is not the case, it can be basically free time save, even if small. Corner correction is useful in a lot more cases than that, as it allows you to greet dashes way earlier than you think. Under a wall, even more so if you demo dash. When dashing downwards, corner correction only applies when starting the dash from mid-air. Sometimes you want to specifically avoid it, but when trying to abuse it, try jumping beforehand and dashing quickly afterwards. There are a bunch of more leniency mechanics that can help you optimize your movement. Closely related to corner correction would be floor snapping. If a horizontal dash is 2 pixels above the floor, you get snapped down to the ground. Wall bounce leniency is another one. and means that you can wall bounce even on the 5th pixel from the wall. Climb jumps, neutral jumps and wall kicks have a similar leniency, but reduced by 2 pixels to 3. Speaking of wall kicks when holding a horizontal direction force you away from the wall with a consistent speed regardless of the horizontal direction you're holding. So you can hold into a wall and get forced away from the wall the same way as when holding away from it. Note that you do have to hold away if you hold grab, so make sure you're not a notorious grab holder. But this forced move away means you can just hold into the wall to either simplify an input and don't have to do some rapid direction changes quickly, or that you just don't risk pressing away from the wall early and losing some very precious frames. A bunch of different entities in the game can give you forced movement, so being a bit more aware of your direction presses and trying to simplify them can help. But we're not finished with vertical movement yet, so let's get back on topic. Upwards transitions, besides giving you dash cooldown, also force your movement. But not your directions, but giving you what we call an auto jump. It's basically just a full height jump with all of the vertical speed and half gravity I talked about earlier. You can cancel this upwards auto jump off the transition with another jump input. So buffering a small jump can make it so you land even quicker out of the transition. But also useful in general when you have some form of upwards movement that you want to cancel early. Small jumps can also be useful when trying to activate any sort of block, because only when moving downwards can you actually activate a block. And a quirk specifically for falling blocks is that they start to fall down faster when not next to them. So try to move away from them quickly after activating them when necessary. Related would be something we do at crumble blocks. While jumping off the side of it works similarly to other blocks, jumping off the top of a crumble block will make it activate immediately. However, they have a grace period at first when landing on them, where regardless of if you jump or not, it still can't immediately disappear. But we can use this to optimize the jump and not fly to the moon. An extended hyper gives you the perfect timing, and the lower jump arc helps optimizing it. Another case of trying to normalize your inputs. Now, if we're back on the topic of jumping, we haven't talked about the third component of the jump: falling. While gravity pulls you down at a constant rate, your normal maximum falling speed is higher than your upward speed. And when holding down, this maximum falling speed cap increases to be equal to dash speed. That's also why it's unnecessary to dash when already falling downwards, and down dashes have some more quirks that make them worse than just falling. Because the dash is a separate state, if you're out of a dash it will start to slow down at first. This is because it has to count up the forced falling timer from the beginning. So it will slow down, trying to match the slower normal falling speed, and because you keep holding down, eventually you will catch up with the fast fall timer and start accelerating downwards again. While holding down doesn't make you accelerate faster, there's still a benefit to it in more situations than just trying to fast fall. There are basically two other cases. The first affects sliding against walls. When just holding horizontally into a wall, you'll slide along the wall, which can reduce your speed heavily and decrease your acceleration rate. Holding down will prevent any form of sliding completely. The second case would be crouching. Sometimes crouch jumping can be useful when trying to avoid a ceiling, either to be able to jump earlier, or just to start falling later. This brings me to the next topic. Hitting a wall or a ceiling generally resets your speed to 0, so it can be useful to hit a ceiling, but especially walls if you want to move into the opposite direction quickly, as you can then immediately accelerate towards that direction instead of having to wait for Madeline to slow down first. Now that we have dabbled into a few horizontal aspects of Madeline's movement, it's time to leave the vertical component behind and talk about horizontal movement, starting with the slowest option, walking. It's by far the slowest movement option, so you really want to minimize your walking time. But in Prologue you can't even prevent that, so let's talk about Dashless Movement briefly. Madeline will accelerate at a consistent rate until she reaches max walking speed, and jumps add a set horizontal speed value to Madeline's current speed. But that means that first, from a standstill, it's better to walk a little bit so you have more initial speed. And secondly, as you probably already know, you want to fit in as many little jumps as possible. However, the speed will not stack as you reach walking speed again in midair due to friction. This jump boost is used all over without always being aware of it, be it to preserve your speed for slightly longer or to get the small speed boost before a dash. A corner boost also gives you this jump boost, even though it's a climb jump. However, this is actually not always the case. To understand why, it's first important to understand how a corner boost works. It actually uses a mechanic called retained speed, where you get your speed refunded after colliding with a wall if you get past the wall within 4 frames. So if you already collided with the wall, it wouldn't matter that you jumped, as the speed before you collided will get refunded. Climb jumps being able to be performed with a 2 pixel gap between Madeline and the wall allows getting the additional speed more consistently. Even the 3rd pixel, the one right next to the wall, allows you to climb jump before colliding. If you throw something against the wall and if you rewind and pause at the right time, your object would be right next to the wall without actually hitting it. The exact same principle. But Madeline doesn't always move 1 pixel in a frame. For example, a horizontal dash already moves her at 4 pixels a frame, and with the 3 pixel range to be able to climb jump, you already see the problem. With enough speed, you might never be in the pixel range to be able to get the jump speed. That's why we often use specific setups to guarantee a good corner boost. Without them, it might be fast on average to use a slightly slower strat than risk getting a so-called bad corner boost. Well, speaking of dashes, they have some neat mechanics to know about. Dashes have a few components to them, but first let's talk about the beginning. The beginning of a dash is 1 non-moving frame, followed by 3 freeze frames that freeze every non-music based thing in this game, even the timer. Whatever input you press at the end of this 4-frame window determines your dash direction. So that means you can change your direction quickly from what you held initially. This can help you not bleeding time by releasing a direction that you want to keep held early, like when going right and wanting to dash upwards, for example. But if you noticed, I mentioned that dashes have 1 non-moving frame. This can mean that it's sometimes slower to dash, as you need to save enough time with your dash for it to compensate for the non-moving frame. But not only dashes have freeze frames, an unimaginable amount of things in this game cause freeze frames. While sometimes annoying, I'm looking at you, Shio Lightning, other times you can use them as buffer for your next action. Or, like I said, to change directions. Oshiro and Seekers have an additional mechanic that slows down the game whenever you're close to them. However, contrary to freeze frames, the slowdown frames do not affect the timer, so you really want to avoid being close to them if possible and try to be aware of it. Now, continuing with dashes, when using a dash, it puts you on a cooldown to not be able to dash immediately afterwards. This cooldown lasts for the entire length of a dash. It even persists if you cancel the dash early by whatever you can think of, like a jump or a transition. While it's often also just fast to buffer a dash out of dash cooldown, this is the perfect opportunity to mention again to normalize your inputs. For example, it would be faster to just dash upwards at the right time at flag 13. But to normalize the timing, you can dash back into the spring and abuse the dash cooldown for updashing at the right time consistently. You will lose a little bit of time, but it makes the optimal updash timing a buffer instead of a 1-frame window. Besides dashing, there are other things in this game that put Madeline into dash cooldown. For example, anything related to Madeline, bubbles, or upwards transitions. While Queen bubbles are just a reskinned dash, fast bubbling any bubble isn't affected by your dash cooldown when dashing into them, so you can buffer a fast bubble while still being affected by dash cooldown. This is also why you see speedrunners often avoid having a dash while trying to get into bubbles, so you can properly fast bubble without risking an early dash. I do want to mention that you can fast bubble the moment you hit the edge of a bubble. You don't have to wait until you get pulled into the center. Finally, it's time to talk about dashes itself and the resulting tech. While supers and hypers are affected by friction, so the speed will decay over time, dashes aren't affected by friction and keep their speed for the whole dash duration. If your previous speed exceeds the horizontal speed of a dash, it will override the horizontal component of dash speed. However, you will lose all speed when the dash ends with one exception: down diagonal dashes. Even with them, it will be reset when colliding with the ground during the dash, as then a dash technically converts into a horizontal dash to be able to move right or left. However, if the dash ends before hitting the ground, you preserve your speed. Down diagonal dashes have another important aspect. If your last dash direction was down diagonal, you get a 1.2 times speed boost next time when colliding with the ground. This can be after your dash is over, where it's then called an ultra, but it can also be right during the dash when you hit the ground. While this speed ends after your dash ends, it still can be very useful to be able to multiply just your horizontal speed during the dash by 1.2 times. As such, you can save quite a bit of time during the dash itself when chaining an extended hyper. The jump for the hyper will always set your speed to a fixed number, but jumping late in the dash extension window, followed by immediately dashing down diagonally again, is the fastest movement to traverse flat ground. But what about little or no initial horizontal speed? Can we then optimize the dash more? The answer is yes. For a hyper, we just need to be crouched during the dash and have a dash that can move horizontally. While a down diagonal dash does fulfill these criteria, a horizontal demo dash also fulfills this. While crouched, it's still just a normal horizontal dash. This can save a little bit of time if you extend a hyper, but it can also make a dash extension harder or flat out impossible, so be aware of that. Trying to avoid crouching when possible is another important optimization. Air friction is the exact same between crouched and uncrouched. Just while on the ground, you have increased friction when crouching, thus reducing your speed. In general, the ground and air do slow you down at different rates. This can sometimes be important to know when trying to optimize strats where you don't want to land immediately due to needing to jump or dash at certain positions. As a little side note, coarse ice mode has less ground friction, so you would need to apply the reverse logic during that. You now have all of this theoretical knowledge, but it's time to see how this translates into a real one, if your brain can still handle more. First and foremost, what even are bottlenecks? To explain it as simply as I possibly can, they're the most limiting factor to overcome to be able to move on to your next action. They often can be broken down to horizontal or vertical bottlenecks. If this concept is hard to grasp at first, let's give you an easy to understand example. Landings. Most of Madeline's maneuvers need ground to perform them, which is why reducing airtime to get back to the ground more quickly is one of the most important skills to practice and develop. Landings are one of the biggest time saves if you basically do this in every single room in this game. You already know about a few tidbits to optimize them more easily if you paid attention in the earlier sections of this video. But otherwise, they just require a bunch of practice and repetition to get perfect. Sometimes it's also better to not worry about a landing and to just keep your dash to be able to use it before landing in the first place. But this is one of the easier to see bottlenecks. This concept can still be hard to grasp, so first you have to ask yourself, what is Madeline's goal for a room, and break it down. So how can you quickly reach a transition, or a certain entity, or a platform? You have to ask yourself these questions, analyze your gameplay, watch other runners, and most importantly, try stuff out yourself. Without talking about some more concepts, it's hard to know what to look for. So, after landings, Another common one is your dash direction and timing. So what I mean with that is when dashing onto a platform or into an object, you want to hit it directly. This could be an unnecessary diagonal dash when a horizontal dash is enough, or a dash that ends too early and you have to move with some slower speed afterwards. Or even a dash from too high where you need to fall down afterwards. This last point is the broadest and most applicable, as it can refer to all kinds of different situations. Be it hitting an entity like a spring for example, or just dashing to a platform. Just keeping your higher falling speed for longer is better than just starting from zero and having to re-accelerate again. This can be especially big when dashing onto a block or a cloud or whatever that activates when Madeline lands on it. But this was still a pretty broad concept. So to generalize less, it's time to give some more direct examples. While the game's geometry isn't always simple, let's start with a straightforward case. So what is the goal here? In this case, it's reaching Verdal. So you want to make sure to wall kick as early as possible while moving upwards and reaching the right side of Verdal at the first possible moment, instead of reaching her higher, or in the worst case even falling into her. This would be an example of a horizontal bottleneck, because moving left is the most limiting factor instead of height. It's best to break down bottlenecks into these concepts that can be applied in multiple places in this game. Jumping early to start moving horizontally quicker is one of these. This can be applied even more broadly, moving into a direction you want to go early if possible. So for example, wall kicking after a transition to move towards your intended direction while you can't, for example, dash yet. This can also mean to cancel a fast movement option early, if that reduces your most limiting factor. This can be jumping early from a wall bounce, or different extension timings. Speaking of extension timings, there are advantages to jumping early and to jumping late in your extension window. Jumping early is often used when wanting to gain height. This can be in general when wanting to go upwards, and additionally to bridge the gap in between dashes due to dash cooldown. So you can jump early and then buffer to dash as soon as possible to limit your vertical bottleneck. Jumping late is good for any form of ultra, as then buffering the dash keeps the most amount of speed. But it can also help when wanting to extend your next move. Dash speed is slower than any resulting tech, so wanting the slightly slower dash speed for longer can help you to keep your dash for the following one when tight on space. Another concept would be releasing jump in places to cut corners closer if you want to move down. I know this might sound obvious, but it's hard to consciously apply it if you're not thinking about it. This can be after a wave dash, like here in the 6A Verdal fight, or a super like here in the last room of Shaft. Another common application is to cut airtime during a hyper to land sooner after an upright, like in the crossing checkpoint of City. Generally, a lot of it is applying the acquired game knowledge. So for example here exiting the hub room in 2A start. We want to exit the room on the right side to dash upwards into the transition and jumping afterwards to get a so-called transition wall bounce. A wall bounce before the transition would just get eaten by the vertical transition, so you might think to super and then upright through the G-block. But there is a better option. A hyper into a buffered upright, as if you remember, a diagonal dash is faster than a jump vertically. And you get your dash back due to the dream block, so that you can reach the transition with just an up dash. Jumping out of the top of the dream block would also be slow, as we still have higher speed from the diagonal dash for a bit. It can be pretty tricky to remember all of these interactions, especially with input-dense sections in the game. The first half of the first Old Trail room is a good example for this. Optimally, you want to make sure to enter the room on the right, as your intent is to go right after all. Your first action is a wave dash, but then it's where a lot of potentially niche things get thrown at you. First, you have hyperspeed following the wave dash. So your next best option is a down diagonal dash to get that sweet 1.2 times speed boost during the dash and not a demo hyper. Then you also have to consider that there is a jump through at play here. So you can start the dash earlier than you think, as the non-moving part of the dash means you aren't moving downwards yet, so you get pushed upwards onto the platform. Then timing the upright dash to reach the wall directly to not have your speed run out early by a preemptive dash. And finally, if you do this optimally, you can do a single climb jump and use the big release window to get a really clean landing with no half gravity. But don't worry if this seems overwhelming. A lot of this will come intuitively over time if you keep practicing while keeping attention to these kind of things. With that said, rooms in this game can be very misleading, as the geometry isn't always straightforward. A notorious example would be this chasm room. You want to get over this metal girder as quickly as possible. So the first instinct might be to wave dash or even demo hyper towards it and then climb jumping over. However, the ideal option is to super, which the transition lines up perfectly, as you want the height here slightly more than the distance. At other times, you can overcomplicate a room. Take this farewell room for example. When getting into this room, your aim is to hit the bird that comes flying into the room as early as possible. So you might think to hyper or extended hyper Cornerboost into the room, following it with an extended hyper into then dashing into the bird or similar options. But when thinking about it, your goal is mostly to just move diagonally. So your optimal option is to hyper into the room and then immediately jump after the transition and do just 2 simple upright dashes into the bird. As you can see, there are a lot of different mechanics and factors that play into movement. With everything said so far, movement is basically just a bunch of tiny optimizations that are hard to grasp for everyone, especially while playing. While I dumped a lot of knowledge on you, a lot of it also just comes down to being comfortable with your inputs and being confident in your gameplay. Top players will make all of that seem easy, but there's a lot of practice and a lot of failures as well behind that gameplay.
I hate everything.
So you still need to go out there and actually play the video game. Visual cues, especially while learning, can help this process immensely. Test your boundaries and limit test your strats. If you can't figure out where you're slow, it might help to watch back your own gameplay and frame advance through portions of it. You can also check out players with better movement and see where they do their inputs. Alternatively, there are a lot of helpful runners in the Celeste Discord server that are always eager to help. After testing your own boundaries, see what you can consistently replicate. Even top runners will often, after limit testing their potential first, opt to play slightly slower to more consistently replicate their movement standard. Especially setups can break when aiming to greed as much as possible. After grinding down rooms, your average execution will improve, which is the goal here. However, sometimes it's definitely easier to just implement a faster strat instead of focusing on improving your current strat's movement. If you do that, make sure to actually time your strat, as it's really easy in this game to copy something badly and lose time in the process. However, don't disregard a fast strat immediately either, but also don't disregard greeting movement immediately as well. There's always a balance to strike on what to improve that you have to find, try, and test for yourself.